Hello, everybody. Now, welcome to our last lecture of the semester, the Week 16 lecture, Ordeal by Fire, the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Abraham Lincoln's election in November of 1860 triggered the movement known as secession. And the headlines screamed it. The Union dissolved. Prior to Lincoln's taking office in the spring of 1861, states belonging to what would soon be known as the Confederacy met, individually at first, and then together, to declare their secession from the United States. The first example was that of South Carolina. We, the people of the state of South Carolina, read their declaration, declare that the union heretofore existing between this state and other states of North America is dissolved, and that the state of South Carolina has resumed her position among the nations of the world as a separate and independent state. That in December of 1860. And what South Carolina began would continue. Between December 24th and February 1st, 7 states total, all of them Southern, all of them slaveholding, declared their secession from the Union. And on February 7th, 1861, those 7 states met to form what they called the Confederate States of America. And though it is often forgotten or sometimes overlooked, or even whitewashed, you might say, from the record of history, the most common reason given for secession, that is, the most common reason given by those 7 states for seceding from the Union, was to protect the institution of slavery. As E.S. Dargan of Alabama said, "The day must come, the day is now come, and Alabama must make her selection, either to secede from the Union and assume the position of a sovereign independent state, or she must submit to a system of policy on the part of the federal government that in a short time will compel her to abolish slavery." And with that, a new nation, a Confederate States of America, was proclaimed. According to the Confederate Congress, these states withdrew from the former Union and formed a new Confederate alliance as an independent government, based on the proper relations of labor and capital. And one should read into this the institution of slavery. Their declaration continued. This step was taken reluctantly, by constraint, and after the exhaustion of every measure that was likely to secure us from interference with our property, equality in the Union, or exemption from submission to an alien government. And so the arch of a new Confederate States of America, beginning with Virginia and Tennessee, moving to North Carolina, Kentucky, Maryland, and on through the states of the slaveholding South, all the way west to Texas. Notice that California was not among the seceded states, was not part of the new Confederacy. In large measure, I think, because California in its 1850 Constitution had declared slavery illegal in the state, and thus never formed part of that Confederate alliance. Now, by the time of Lincoln's inauguration in March of 1861, the United States of America, as it had been proclaimed at the time of our Constitution, the ratifying of the Constitution in 1788, that United States of America no longer existed. Abraham Lincoln was forced to recognize this, of course, in his inaugural address. That there are persons in one section or another who seek to destroy the Union at all events, and are glad of any pretext to do it, said Lincoln, I will neither affirm nor deny. But if there be such, I need address no word to them. To those, however, who really love the Union, may I not speak. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. And so from Lincoln's first inaugural, the tacit recognition that the country had split, symbolized perhaps by the U.S. Capitol building itself, shown here in 1861 about the time of Lincoln's inauguration, undergoing its reconstruction with the as yet to be completed center dome still missing, as if the country itself were now somehow unfinished. Something of a standoff ensued, that is, between the formerly seceded states and the rest of the Union. A standoff that would only be resolved if one side or the other were to provoke an armed conflict. Lincoln had announced that he would in fact maintain custody of the federal military installations, even as the seceded states began to claim those within their territorial boundaries, most famously now that of the federal fort known as Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston Bay, South Carolina. Fort Sumter was a federal military fort that guarded the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, and military forces representing the seceded state of South Carolina demanded the fort, which was garrisoned by a United States Army regiment, that it be turned over to the Confederacy. And on April 12, 1861, the firing of Fort Sumter, that is, the firing on the fort by the Confederate batteries on the shores of Charleston, began the bloodiest war in America's history. As reported in the Charleston Mercury newspaper, April 13, 1861, the following day, the bombardment of Fort Sumter, so long and anxiously expected, has at length become a fact accomplished. The outline of this great volcanic crater was illuminated with a line of twinkling lights. The clustering shells illuminated the sky above it. The balls clattered thick as hail upon its sides, and at the break of day, amidst the bursting of bombs and the roaring of ordnance, and before thousands of spectators whose homes and liberties and lives were at stake, was enacted this first great scene in the opening drama of what it is presumed will be a most momentous military act. Reading now the Charleston Mercury, one has the feeling that the firing of Fort Sumter struck observers almost like a celebratory display of fireworks, maybe a July 4th. In other words, an undeniable enthusiasm seems to jump from the pages of the Charleston Mercury in the reporting. An event that the newspaper characterized as a splendid pyrotechnic exhibition. Now, no lives were lost, no human lives were lost in the firing of Sumter. It was in that sense a bloodless battle that must have seemed to observers like a splendid pyrotechnic exhibition. Few were willing to say at that moment that this bloodless battle would front the nation's bloodiest war, setting Americans against Americans with this civil war. From the very first, from the battle over Sumter, the Confederate Colonel P.G.T. Beauregard, who you see below, commanded the Confederate gunners that day who fired on Fort Sumter, while it was Robert Anderson, here to the left, who commanded the garrison of U.S. Army troops inside the fort. Years earlier, Anderson was an artillery instructor at the West Point Military Academy. His best artillery student, who he invited to stay on as a student instructor, was none other than P.G.T. Beauregard. 3 million soldiers fought in the war, and more than 600,000, in fact closer to 700,000, died. A war that can be defined as Americans killing Americans on American soil, as we are reminded by the photographs taken during the war. This was to be a modern scale of war, and it wasn't long before Americans understood that this war would be fought on a scale unfamiliar to the past. In 2 days, during the Battle of Shiloh, for example, in 1862, more Americans fell than all of America's previous wars combined, in just 2 days of fighting. And in one day at the Battle of Antietam, which you see depicted here in this sketch, also in 1862, 4,800 Americans were killed and 18,500 wounded. That was more casualties than America suffered during the D-Day invasion of World War II. This was a modern war, where the whole population mobilized, and the advantage and numbers and resources, it is true, belonged to the Union. The Union, that is the North, had a population of about 21 million, spread across 21 states, while the Confederacy's population was about 9 million, including almost 4 million slaves, spread across 11 states. But those numbers alone don't tell the full story. And what attended the coming of the war seemed more often to be a celebration rather than a sadness, especially in the South, as those who would come to be called rebels eagerly enlisted in their military regiments. "I feel that I would like to shoot a Yankee," said one young man in New Orleans, "yet I know this would not be in harmony with the spirit of Christianity." 1/3 of the South's initial volunteers were turned away, said they wouldn't be needed, and regiments that formed gave themselves colorful names like the Tallapoosa Thrashers, the Cherokee Lincoln Killers, and the Richmond Grays, who you see photographed here at the outset of the war, with their new coats and new hats, bristling with arms, and for one, even a dagger. Not all were so giddy or celebratory. In fact, a warning was issued by one who had fought in previous wars. The governor of Texas, Sam Houston. "Let me tell you what is coming," he said. "After the sacrifice of countless millions of treasure and hundreds of thousands of lives, you may win Southern independence. But I doubt it. The North is determined to preserve this Union. They are not a fiery, impulsive people as you are. But when they begin to move in a given direction, they move with the strong momentum and perseverance of a military avalanche." And it is true that the North responded to the firing on Sumter with great resolve and determination. "Secede on paper as much as you please," said one Northern clergyman in 1861. "We will not make war upon you for that. But we will maintain the supremacy of the Constitution and laws. If you make war on the Union, we will defend it at all costs, and the guilt of blood be on your heads." These are photographs of Union Square, what would come to be called Union Square in New York City, as the President, Lincoln, called for Northern enlistment. A massive crowd appeared, and the flag that was raised was the flag that had been saved from Fort Sumter just a week or so earlier. And thus armies now appeared in America. At the beginning of 1861, the United States Army had only 7,000 full-time troops, most of them stationed in the far west. But by year's end, the Union Army, what was now to be known as the Union Army, the Army of the North, had 700,000 men. And though yet the South had perhaps the greatest general, a a career U.S. Army officer and former head of the West Point Military Academy, Robert E. Lee. Robert Edward Lee was offered the command of the Union Army by President Lincoln, but he turned down the offer, resigned his commission in the U.S. Army after a lifetime of career service. Instead, he took up a commission in the new Army of Northern Virginia, and the reason he gave was that he would not fight against his country, by which he meant the state of Virginia. The first full-scale battle, which took place in Northern Virginia, only proved one thing, that there would be no quick or decisive victory by either side, much to the shock and dismay of the spectators who had traveled out to the Bull Run battlefield with picnic lunches to watch what they hoped would be an entertaining activity. That July, the two armies had met just outside the nation's capital, near a town called Manassas and a creek called Bull Run. Each army had about 33,000 troops that day, and at first things went well for the Union. By day's end, however, the Confederates had won in a rout, leaving panicked politicians to fear that Washington, D.C. might be stormed by the rebels. Within months of the war's beginning, an unanticipated problem arose. As slaves, that is, as enslaved people living in the slaveholding states of the Confederacy, took the opportunities provided by war to liberate themselves. Now recall that in his inaugural speech, Abraham Lincoln declared, quote, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." Yet despite that proclamation, early in the war, sizable numbers of enslaved people escaped to freedom by leaving their plantations and seeking refuge behind Union Army lines. A Union Army general, Benjamin Butler, declared these slaves to be, quote, "contraband of war," that is, property belonging to the enemy that now could be appropriated by the Union military. As one writer puts it, the escaped slaves robbed the South of crucial labor, undermined slavery, and helped the cause of the North, first with military intelligence, then with their labor, and finally with their lives on the battlefield. This was an unanticipated development, an unanticipated problem for President Lincoln and the managers of the war, because though he had proclaimed no interest in interfering with slavery at the war's outset, clearly slavery was interfering with his plans. The federal government was left little choice and was forced, in fact, to act upon the issue of those now called freedmen. And the result, after much debate, political debate in Washington, D.C., is the passing of two laws recognizing the freedom of escaped slaves. The first Confiscation Act of 1861 and the Second Confiscation Act of 1862 were passed by Congress and defined all slaves held as property by Confederates and their supporters as contraband and liable to confiscation by the military of the United States. The conception of the war was changing as a result, as political pressure was mounting on Lincoln to deal with the slavery issue. By the summer of 1862, Lincoln had resolved to issue some type of executive order regarding the emancipation of slaves. After famously telling editor Horace Greeley, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it," Lincoln made the surprise announcement that a general order of emancipation was forthcoming. And on January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation took effect, declaring that slaves held in Confederate territory were deemed free. But note, slaves held in Confederate territory. That meant the states that were in active rebellion against the U.S., from Virginia to Florida, Florida to Texas. Only two areas exempted: the western part of Virginia, which itself would secede from Virginia and become a new state, West Virginia, in the Union, and the area of New Orleans, captured by the Union. The so-called border states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware were exempted from the Emancipation Proclamation for fear that they would resist and join with the Confederacy. They were, up to that point, mostly neutral. So why would Lincoln declare that slaves living in areas no longer under his political control, why would he declare those slaves free? Because it was an edict looking to the future. With each state of the Confederacy retaken by the Union military, that is, with each defeat of a Confederate army and the reacquiring of that state politically for the Union, then the Emancipation Proclamation would in fact take hold. In other words, the war from this point out wasn't to be simply a war of reunion, nor the Union Army an army to end a rebellion merely, but instead this would be now a war of abolition, and the Union Army a war of freedom, and an army of freedom. Lincoln's address at the dedication of a federal military cemetery in November of that year, 1863, transformed the purpose of the war. As he put it, a new birth of freedom would now take hold. A picture of Lincoln about the time of the Gettysburg Address, in which he famously proclaimed 77 years ago, evoking the year of 1776, the year in which the Declaration of Independence was issued and the United States of America was born. 77 years ago, our fathers, he said, brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So Lincoln is evoking the words of Thomas Jefferson from the Declaration of Independence. And note, his language is strangely neutral, considering that he was in the midst of a great civil war. It is our fathers, inclusive of all Americans, and meaning Southerners as well. A new nation that is a single, unified body, political and legal body, known as a nation. No reference to North or South. No us versus them. No friend versus enemy, but a single nation. Lincoln was already sewing the fabric of American nationalism, even though the war was not over. And it was the decision to issue Emancipation Proclamation, I think, more than any other single fact, that pushes Lincoln in this direction. He says, now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. In other words, a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to equality. For that nation to endure, Lincoln suggests a Union victory is necessary. Slavery must be destroyed for the nation to live. That this nation under God, he says, shall have a new birth of freedom. Words that would help transform the American purpose and reinforce the promise made at the time of the Declaration of not only equality, but liberty for all people. Now, in other ways, the Civil War would be transformative and open the door to a modern age. The sheer production of arms and supplies necessary, which depended on modern methods of manufacturing and production, initiated by the early advent of industrialization, the early industrial revolution, would now define this war as a modern war. The Springfield Armory in Massachusetts had the capacity to produce 500,000 rifles and muskets during the war, utilizing machine-tooled, interchangeable parts and an assembly line style of what would come to be called mass production. The future decades would bring the mass production of everything from Singer sewing machines to Ford automobiles. The war also called upon modern transportation and logistics. There were more than 200 railroads in existence at the start of the war, and throughout, trains transported troops, supplies, and weapons, greatly enlarging the physical and geographical scope of military operations. The war also occasions the advent of modern information systems and media. The nation was kept well informed of the events during wartime due to on-site reporting, filing of dispatches via the telegraph, and reproduction of photographs. The Associated Press news organization was created during the war to facilitate the sharing of news and information. An estimated 1 million photographs were taken during the Civil War. So too are the mobilizing of civilian agencies, a harbinger of times to come. The U.S. Sanitary Commission was an organization that mobilized civilian workers in support of treating wounded soldiers and improving the sanitary conditions in the battlefield hospitals and military camps. Most of the employees, in fact, were women, and the work of nurses during the war contributed to the professionalization of nursing. The war, it seems, was transformative in all kinds of unintended ways, and agencies like the U.S. Sanitary Commission would become models for future civilian and government organizing efforts. And finally, the Civil War demonstrated that no longer would war be confined to the battlefield and soldiers only. No, in the modern age, the age of total war, those boundaries would be largely surpassed. And this was illustrated in the last months of the war, as the Georgia and Carolina campaigns of William Tecumseh Sherman demonstrated that no clear line, no clear boundary separated civilians from soldiers or the battlefield from the farmhouse or the city. Sherman's famous March to the Sea in 1864 demonstrated that modern armies would intrude on civilian populations and wage total war against the very resources that supported an enemy's civilization. When the mayor of Atlanta complained to General Sherman that civilians were suffering the hard hand of war, Sherman replied that war is cruelty and you cannot refine it. And what he understood was that as long as soldiers in the field received the support and adulation of civilians back home, and as long as civilians went to work in wartime factories, that it would never do to simply win battles and hope to defeat a mobilized enemy. A much more thorough or total war effort would be required to convince even those civilians that supporting any longer their cause was utterly futile, and thus to defeat not only armies in battle, but the civilian population in spirit and in material sustenance. This would be a lesson learned and repeated again and again, right down to our own day, as the traditional boundary lines were eliminated and the advent of total war meant that the scale of destruction itself, a scale of destruction that in the U.S. Civil War reached nearly 700,000 dead, more than all the rest of our wars combined. That is to say, more Americans dying in the Civil War than died in the other wars fought throughout our history, all of them combined.